So let me introduce my friend Bhaskar Chakravorti. He is the Senior Associate Dean and Founding Director of the Institute for Business in the Global Context. And he's going to talk to us about lessons on innovation. So Bhaskar, if you could join me here on the stage. Okay. And yes, he is a professor, in spite of this.
All right, get up and dance, everybody. Anyone recognize the song? Come on, am I dating myself? Okay, this is from the 60s. That's a song called Liza Jane, sung by a kid called Davy Jones. You probably never heard that song, and you probably never heard of Davy Jones. But I hope most of you, and I hope I'm not dating all of you, at some point in your life, groove to David Bowie. Oh yeah, absolutely. So the topic of this little talk is everything I learned about innovation, I learned from David Bowie. And I've been involved in innovation for about 25 years. And I've seen it from the inside of high-tech R&D, from the outside consulting to companies on the topic of innovating within large organizations and innovating in breakaway entrepreneurial organizations, and looking at the dynamics of innovation both in places like Silicon Valley and Boston, and even in places like Midland, Michigan, but also in parts of the world that are very far away from California or Boston, such as sub-Saharan Africa or India or China. And innovation happens to be everywhere. And as it turns out, we have received umpteen lessons on innovation from lots of gurus, lots of people who teach in business schools and other wonderful places. And at some point, you begin to wonder if everybody is following the same precepts, then how do I break away from the pack? And the one guru that I keep coming back to, who gave me some fresh insights on innovation, is this guy. So here's a little bit more.
Ground control to Major Tom.
How many of you recognize this song? There you go.
Ground
there you go.
To Major Tom.
So when Davy Jones sang songs like every other kid in the 1960s, it's completely forgettable. He just disappeared without a trace. And then he broke through with the Space Oddity. Completely different sound, taking folk rock in a different direction. And here's a man who essentially derived his inspiration from what was happening around him. Stanley Kubrick, I need to change the slide, otherwise the music won't stop. And I'm sure you would love to spend the next 15 minutes listening to David Bowie, but I've been asked to intervene somewhere in between. So here I am. But the first lesson from Bowie is seize the zeitgeist. Look around you, sense what's going on. Sense where the fear is. Sense where the hope is. Sense where the fire is. And put that into whatever you do. And this was a time, this is a post-Sputnik era, United States. Stanley Kubrick had just come out with an absolutely terrifying vision of outer space, of travel to outer space, called 2001: A Space Odyssey. And then that last picture of man landing on the moon. And we continue to play out our hopes as we reach out beyond the immediate circle within which we live and breathe to the vast beyond outside where we can't breathe and where everything is weightless. And we can even compare apples and oranges by looking at them directly in the face. This is obviously a much more recent space oddity. Scott Kelly, who just broke a record for an American in space, in the space station. Now, David Bowie, his persona morphed over and over and over again. As the zeitgeist shifted, he changed. His music changed, his looks changed, the narrative around David Bowie changed. So seize the zeitgeist, the road to reinvention. Remember, reinvention, constant reinvention, is the first lesson of innovation. There is a website called supbowie.com, where if you go to the website and enter your age, it will tell you at that age what David Bowie was doing. I guess somebody has a lot of time on their hands. At my age, I actually did this. At my age, he was offered a knighthood by Queen Elizabeth, and he turned it down. He said, "I don't know what that's for. I have no use for it. This was not something I spent my life working on." This, by the way, is Banksy's depiction of the Queen and David Bowie meeting. This is the only time they met, was on a Banksy graffiti. I guess David never went out to meet Royal Highness. So that leads to the second lesson from David Bowie. Look ahead. Don't just absorb the zeitgeist that's right in front of your nose, but imagine what's about to come around the corner, and then work backwards from that end game, because that will prepare you to reinvent. That will prepare you to adapt. That will keep you ready for where things are going. At the turn of this century, David Bowie made the comment that music is going to be like running water. Music is going to be like running water. If you're a musician, you're not going to make any money from just putting music out there. The only way to monetize your artistry is to be out there doing things in front of the public. Shows, personas, a narrative, theater. That is what's going to sell. And David Bowie was far ahead of his time in realizing that the product of music was changing. And indeed, right around that time, this thing came out. And proved David Bowie's prediction pretty much bang on. And it's this multiple reincarnations of the Bowie phenomenon. Bowie as theater is a classic rendering of somebody looking ahead, working back from the end game, and then realizing how do you constantly keep changing yourself. Just yesterday, I just heard a news story about Justin Bieber, who apparently when you look at the revenue lines in the Justin Bieber business model, one huge revenue line is called the meet and greet, where you pay some extra money to meet Justin Bieber. And that's a huge part of the show. Now, it turns out that that revenue line has become so successful that the meet and greet is not sitting with Justin Bieber in a small conference room. You have to stand in line along with thousands to meet Justin Bieber. So eventually they cancel that. So you can see how in David Bowie's business, something that is new and innovative will eventually lose its shine, and you have to then think of the next one. And that leads me to the third lesson of innovation from David Bowie. Failure is inevitable because you've got to keep trying. You're not going to be a perfect forecaster of what's ahead. But failure is a perfect foundation from which you learn, and you rebuild. This is David Bowie sitting at a computer. Who would imagine David Bowie as a digital guru? How many of you are aware that David Bowie started his first, was an internet service provider called Bowie.net, one of the earliest internet service providers? And it did a whole bunch of things. You were allowed to sort of create a user profile. You could listen to Bowie songs. And this was long before Pandora or Spotify or iTunes. Of course, Bowie.net doesn't exist anymore. But that was the foundation of a series of experiments. And he never stopped experimenting. And this is what the great companies that we've been talking about today are all about. It's time that we focus not necessarily on the successes of those companies, but the much longer list of failures. And Google is among the first in that ranking of the number of failed attempts that it has got, and it pretty much wears its graveyard with pride. Now, this is an obvious one. Think beyond the product. We've talked about this earlier today. But you've got to not just think about the business model, but you've got to reinvent the business model. You've got to reinvent the business model in completely non-obvious ways, in completely non-obvious ways, in a way that bucks the trend of the industry. This is just not a real document, but a rendering of something called the Bowie bond. David Bowie was the first artist to monetize his intellectual property in the form of a bond. And he collected $55 million by selling a bond whose collateral was 10 years' worth of royalties from his music. So mortgage-backed securities, collateralized the CDOs, all that stuff that had, just a few years back took all of us down. Well, this guy was there long before those geniuses on Wall Street. Completely non-intuitive business models. How many times have you heard, both at this conference and conferences like this, where people have said, the largest hotel company in the world does not own any hotel rooms. The largest taxi cab company in the world does not own any cars. Well, one of the largest media companies in the world, media distribution companies in the world, actually hasn't followed that rule. They have created their own content. So they have bucked a trend. They bucked a trend that is repeated over and over again at conferences, to the point that all the competitors line up with received wisdom, and then you break that rule. And there are innumerable examples of companies who've done this and stayed on top of their game. Take a company like Inditex or Zara, which has broken every rule of global retailing and has stayed on top of global retail. Or take a company like Lego, which at one point almost disappeared and then survived and did really well, again, by breaking every rule, such as not manufacturing its products in China or other low-cost locations. The final lesson from David Bowie: don't stop with yourself. Inspire others. Don't let the music stop. So David Bowie inspired lots of others, some of whom did all right, some of whom don't look that good, and some of whom, unfortunately, like this guy, Freddie Mercury, died before he could really sort of fulfill his full potential. Now, this is going to be the story of great innovators. A great example is a company whose name is uttered many times at conferences like this, and was uttered again today. And the name of the company is Uber. A few years back, you could pretty much walk over to any venture capitalist office and say, I have an app that is an Uber for fill in the blanks, and they'd basically write you a blank check. Try doing that today. Too many people try to pretty much follow that same story. So inspire others, but inspire others to rise to your heights. David Bowie was not just one crazy-looking guy. He was many, many crazy-looking people. And unless others can keep up with that, they're never going to reach the heights that he reached. So I'll just close with this notion of the idea of creating an Uber for this or that, the idea of disruption, which we hear about over and over again, the idea of reinvention. It's true. We are all going to get disrupted if we don't understand how technology is going to change our businesses. But then the next question is, so what? What do we do? You can't break up your existing business model. You can't break up your existing product lines just for the sake of disruption. You have to be able to make a right choice. And a lot of the companies that went in to be the Uber for X, Y, and Z, they weren't making the right choices. They pretty much followed a mantra that was given to them at some industry conference. And most of them are not going to survive. In fact, a lot of people are questioning whether Uber itself will survive if it follows its current path. So we'll reconvene in our next conference or the conference after that, and perhaps check how that mantra is doing. So inspire others. Don't let the music stop. Now that's a very high bar. So I'll just close out with this image from Berlin, and a much cleaned up looking David Bowie, and cleaned up Iggy Pop. This was David Bowie after he was recovering from his drug addiction days, went to Berlin at the very lowest point in his career, and then came up with the Berlin Trilogy. This is the song Heroes, one of the great electronic rock anthems ever. And with that, thank you. Thank you for your attention.
We'll keep us together. We can be there.